The modern Russian state began as a tiny principality in the Moscow area that, despite invasions, coups, assassinations, and revolutions, rose to superpower status and global influence. To see how this happened, join me for a brief look at the history and politics of Russia. The earliest known human settlement in present-day Russian territory is a site in the banks of the River Don, in the southern part of the country, which dates from 45,000 BCE. That date would make this Stone Age outpost not just the first in Russia, but in all of Europe. After that, we know that Indo-European and Ural-Altaic people settled there, but little about their culture or way of life. Same goes for the East Slavs themselves, the ancestors of most modern Russians, who were largely unknown before their spread across the central Russian woodlands in the 9th century AD, in the creation of the Kievan Rus, a loose federation in Eastern and Northern Europe, with a ruling dynasty established by Rurik, a prince of Scandinavian origin. Originally set around Novgorod, it continued to grow from the 9th century to the mid-11th century, when it stretched from the Black Sea in the south to the White Sea in the north. Initially pagan, the Kievan Rus converted to Christianity in 988 AD, when one of its monarchs, Vladimir the Great, was baptized. Although legend has it the first attempts in the region were by St. Andrew, the apostle of Jesus, at a much earlier point. Christianization, in turn, brought connections to the Byzantine Empire, which is where the missionaries came from, and the introduction of a new script based on Greek letters, what we now call the Cyrillic alphabet. The characters themselves were modified multiple times, including by Peter the Great, but now are the basis for the Russian writing system. 200 years on, the Kievan Rus regime began to weaken in the 11th century when it started to suffer attacks from nomadic Turkic peoples like the Pechenegs. To make matters worse, the European Crusades revived west-east trade routes, which led to the Rus becoming an economic backwater. As a result, the Kievan Rus began to break apart into numerous principalities who would battle with each other for the next 2 centuries. Some of these include Novgorod in the far north, and then Smolensk around the present-day city of the same name. Another one was Rostov, later known as Vladimir Suzdal, which would eventually include the city of Moscow, founded in 1147. This dynamic was appended when a new actor entered the stage, in 1223. The Mongols. The Mongols were a set of nomadic tribes that originated in what is now Mongolia and became a powerful conquering force after they unified under the leadership of Genghis Khan in 1206. So powerful, in fact, that they would end up becoming the largest contiguous empire in world history. In 1223, Genghis's forces decimated the Russian armies at the Battle of the Kalka River, but the Khan died in 1227 before he could take over the Russian lands, so it fell to his grandson, Batu Khan, to finish the job. He returned to do just that, and in 1236 he laid waste to Bulgar and Rostov-Suzdal, and destroyed most of the other Russian principalities, including Kiev, within 4 years. Novgorod was saved only by spring floods that prevented the invaders from crossing the marshes around the city. The western parts of the Mongol Empire did not maintain themselves as part of unified Mongol rule for very long. Instead, the various areas were divided into khanates, and the Russian lands ended up as part of the Golden Horde, a vast area that was dominated by Batu Khan and his successors from Sarai on the Volga, near what today is Volgograd. At its peak, the Golden Horde's territory included most of Eastern Europe, stretching from the banks of the Dnieper River in the west to deep into Siberia in the east, and south to the Caucasus. The Horde's control over its subjects, however, was indirect. Few Mongols remained west of the Urals after the conquest. Instead, they allowed local princes to retain their title in exchange for them keeping order, providing soldiers, and collecting taxes in a mutually beneficial arrangement. The principality thrived under Mongol rule, but it was still subject to centrifugal forces as the different elite Russian factions fought for land and power. Thus, Vladimir eventually divided itself into 11 tiny states, including Pereslav, Nizhny Novgorod, Tver, and of course Moscow, to name a few. The two most powerful of these were Moscow and Tver, but the former began to surpass the latter in the early 1300s under Daniel I, and later under Ivan Kalita, especially after Ivan helped the Golden Horde put down Tver's insurrection against the Mongols in 1327. Eventually, the principality got strong enough to challenge the Mongols itself, and in 1380 attempted to do just that at the Battle of Kulikovo, where the Russians decidedly beat the Golden Horde under Dmitry of Moscow. Unfortunately for them, the Mongols regrouped and crushed the uprising, but it was a turning point. Within a century, the Russians got rid of Mongol rule entirely. It helped that the Golden Horde developed serious internal divisions, not least because of the rise of another great historical conqueror in the early 1400s, Timur, or as he's better known in the West, Tamerlane. The official end came in 1480 under the leadership of Ivan the Great. Free from the Mongols, Ivan continued to expand Moscow's territories and set the basis for the Russian state. He tripled the duchy's size, annexing Rostov in 1474, Novgorod in 1478, Tver in 1485, and Vyatka in 1489. His son, Vasily III, and grandson, Ivan IV, better known as the Terrible, continued his legacy, incorporating the Skov Republic in 1510, the Ryazan Republic in 1521, and moving into Asia and the Volga in the 1580s, annexing two khanates, that of Kazan and Astrakhan. Ivan was also the first person to take the title of Tsar, a way to make claim for Moscow as the Third Rome and claim for himself the power of the Orthodox Church. Ivan the Terrible established the first feudal parliament of Russian states, the Zemsky Sobor, had St. Basil's Cathedral constructed, and brought the first printing press to Russia, but he is best remembered for his reign of terror and sacking of Novgorod in 1570, and his disastrous wars against the Livonians and Crimean Tatars, the latter of which almost saw the burning of Moscow to the ground in 1571. Even worse, in 1581, he killed his son, Ivan Ivanovich, in a fit of rage, which left Russia with an unprepared heir to the throne in Fyodor I. This, in turn, led directly to a crisis that Russians call the Time of Troubles. This period lasted about 20 years and began with Fyodor's death, who left no heir and marked the end of the Rurik dynasty. The ensuing political instability and lawlessness invited foreign invasions and the loss of Smolensk to the Polish, and exacerbated a crop failure which led to the Russian famine of 1601-1603, a catastrophe that is estimated to have killed 30% of the country's population. Instability finally eased when Michael Romanov was elevated by the Zemsky Sobor to the Tsar's throne, initiating a new dynasty that would last until the 20th century. During his reign, Russia would revert to its expansionism and would start its long conquest of Siberia, a feat that became possible because of the Cossack explorers, a semi-nomadic people noted for their military service, and because the riches of the fur trade made control of this region a very profitable proposition. It helped that Russia's traditional adversaries, the Swedish and the Polish, went to war with each other, which brought peace to the country. In the meantime, Russia continued its march towards centralization and despotism, especially as it moved to full serfdom. This was a mode of labor where peasants called serfs were legally tied to estates, restricted from moving, and treated as property, basically slavery in all but name. Having it as a form of labor caused plenty of localized uprisings over the years, but it also expanded the power of the Tsar, as the local elites were more likely to cooperate with Moscow in exchange for help putting down any potential rebellions. Thus, not surprisingly, any successful reform attempts usually began with the Tsar. One of the most famous was Peter the Great's efforts to westernize the country. He moved his capital to St. Petersburg, which was built in the neoclassical and Baroque styles popular in Europe at the time, reorganized his army along modern lines, forced his court to wear a Western dress, and attempted to make Russia a maritime power. Those who revolted against him, like the Bulovin Rebellion of 1701, were crushed, and the European powers who opposed him, like Sweden, got war. This latter conflict, the Great Northern War of 1700 to 1721, not only ended the Swedish Empire, but gave Peter control over the Gulf of Finland and the eastern shores of the Baltic Sea. Another famous effort came with Catherine the Great, the wife of the grandson of Peter the Great, Peter III. She was not, as it is sometimes believed, the first empress of Russia, but the third, after Catherine I, wife of Peter the Great, and her daughter Elizabeth. In any case, Catherine the Great expanded schools and publishing, and at first tried to bring Enlightenment ideals to Russia, and even thought about abolishing serfdom, but they came to naught. Instead, she soon changed her mind and made serfdom worse, diminishing the little autonomy they had and expanding it to Ukrainians who up to that moment had been free. Thus, most Russian people did not see much benefit from her reign, but Russia itself did continue to expand under her rule. Wars against Turkey and savvy divide and rule tactics in Poland led to the Russians gaining control of the Black Sea's north coast and what is today western Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. Famously, there's a story that when she sailed through the Black Sea to survey her new domains, her minister, Grigory Potemkin, had fake settlements set up to impress her. Historians dispute that this ever actually happened, but it nonetheless gave us the term Potemkin village, which is now used to mean any construction created to make a place look better than it actually is. Perhaps the most important reform of all, however, came from Alexander II, the great-grandson of Catherine the Great, in 1861, the emancipation of the serfs who constituted around 38% of the population. There had been serious previous attempts, especially by his father Nicholas I, but the massive losses during the Crimean War, which saw hundreds of thousands of Russians die, convinced the Tsar that the empire needed to leave its feudal past behind. It was thought that emancipating the serfs would lead to the creation of a modern market economy and would strengthen the Tsar. Instead, it paved the way for eventual revolution. That was for three reasons. First, while the reform did bring freedom to the serfs, it often did not provide them with land. which meant that while their lot improved, it was limited and often ended up desperate for work. The second was that Russia's long history of centralization, authoritarianism, and failed reform had already sparked radical movements inspired in the ideas of people like Mikhail Bakunin, such as nihilism and anarchism. These ideas in turn, combined with another movement known as the Narodniks, a type of agricultural socialism, eventually politicized both those who ended up working in the new industries of the Russian Empire and the freed serfs who remained in the countryside and who found Alexander II's reforms to be lacking. Finally, Russia was a multi-ethnic and multicultural empire, but Russian orthodoxy and European ideas were favored, as was Russification, which led to more radicalism, violence, and increased anti-Russian nationalism. Thus, the Tsarist autocracy was on a coalition course with radicalism, and it would not survive. First, the anarchists managed to kill Alexander II in 1881 with a couple of homemade bombs as he rode his carriage in downtown St. Petersburg. Later, after a massive humiliation in a war against Japan that began in 1904, the shooting of demonstrators by the Imperial Guard, known as Bloody Sunday, and subsequent massive strikes all around the country, there was a failed revolution in 1905, which prompted the creation of the Duma, a kind of legislature that limited the power of the Tsar under the so-called October Manifesto. It seemed like Russia was moving towards a liberal democracy, but violence continued, including the assassination of Pyotr Stolypin, a capable Russian prime minister, and then things got worse. Russia opted to enter World War I in 1914 to defend Serbia from Austria-Hungary, and then promptly suffered a setback after setback. Over 1 million casualties mounted, food and fuel shortages became common, and inflation surged. As the Tsar dissolved the Duma and took personal command on the field, he left his wife in charge in St. Petersburg. Unfortunately, her rule was not much better, especially as she seemed to be under the influence of a monk named Rasputin. Order eventually broke down, kicking off the February Revolution. As a result, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate in 1917, and a provisional government was set up under dual power mandate, a system divided between the Duma and the Soviets, working councils that had sprung up throughout the empire after the previous attempt at revolution in 1905. Control was roughly divided between foreign policy and essential government functions for the Duma, while domestic policy went to the Soviets, which made the provisional government, especially its moderate wing, very weak, as they had responsibility but little power. The provisional government then announced elections for November 1917 and resumed the war effort, despite its unpopularity. The Soviets, especially the largest of all, the Petrograd Soviet, were divided into three main factions. These were the Socialist Revolutionaries, the Mensheviks, and the Bolsheviks. This last grouping was under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, a long-standing socialist leader against the Tsarist regime who ended up in exile in 1900 but returned to Russia after the February Revolution. At first, the Bolsheviks were the smallest faction, but their slogan, "Bread, Peace, Land," which promised to end the war and redistribute goods to the masses, made them popular, especially after a failed coup against the Soviets in July 1917. Lenin recognized the weakness of the provisional government and moved to successfully seize the government on October 24, 1917. Once in power, the Bolsheviks immediately signed an armistice with the Germans, redistributed land, moved the capital to Moscow, and set out to arrest, torture, or kill anyone who opposed them. By 1918, there was a full-blown civil war between the Bolsheviks, the Reds, and everyone else, the Whites, that led to the killing of around 12 million people, including the murder of Nicholas II and his family. By 1922, lacking the disunity of the Whites and with the advantage of controlling the heart of Russia and the army, the Bolsheviks were victorious. Now in full control, Lenin began a sweeping nationalization in all economic sectors and strict administrative control by the Soviet government, which in turn was controlled by the Communist Party. Having succeeded in creating the first socialist state in the world, the USSR, he didn't live long to see his work in action. After a series of debilitating strokes, he died in 1924, leaving a power vacuum that was soon filled by Joseph Stalin. Stalin continued the collectivization of agriculture that Lenin started, as well as massive purges. This led to multiple famines and the killing of party members who might not be enthusiastic enough about Stalin, and even Stalin's own generals. In all, it is estimated that in the late 1930s, the Stalinists killed as many as 700,000 people, including 400 of the Red Army's 700 generals. Meanwhile, Europe would soon find itself at war again, and the USSR would be a key player. In 1939, Stalin and Hitler signed a non-aggression pact that divided Poland between them. And there was even talk about having the Soviet Union join the Axis powers. But in the end, Hitler changed his mind and invaded the USSR in 1941. The operation was catastrophic for the Soviet people as they experienced some of the worst atrocities and longest sieges of the war, including the Siege of Leningrad, previously St. Petersburg, and the Battle of Moscow. Around 24 million people died in the war, many of them deliberately starved by the Nazis, others exterminated as part of the Jewish genocide. In the end, however, Stalin and the Soviet Union prevailed, along with the Allies, which left them as one of the two global superpowers and as one of the architects of the new global system, including the United Nations. Not that this new status benefited the average person living in the USSR. For one thing, whatever bonhomie existed between the World War II allies soon evaporated as ideological differences led to a Cold War between the Soviets and the US. That is, a global struggle between communism and capitalism, but where the two superpowers fought each other only through proxies, never directly. This only made any criticism of the government even more of a no-no in Soviet Russia, and so it would continue for the next few decades, even after Stalin's death in 1953. At first, the Soviet economy began to grow at a fast pace after World War II, and its admirers could even speak of an alternative economic model well into the 1960s. As both growth and GDP per capita continued to increase. But then a long stagnation began, and by the 1980s the USSR seemed to be in a deep malaise. Soviet leaders such as Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to tackle this with new policies known as glasnost and perestroika. Together these were aimed at rooting out corruption and allowing some liberties to discuss the problems of the country. Instead, the fall of the Berlin Wall, coupled with the political opening, allowed some of the republics to declare their independence, beginning with Lithuania in 1990, followed by the other Baltic states and Georgia. With the economy in freefall, it got even worse when some communist hardliners attempted to overthrow Gorbachev in a coup but failed. With a weakened Moscow, even more republics declared their independence, and on December 8, 1991, Boris Yeltsin, the elected leader of the Soviet Russian Republic, got together with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus and declared the disbandment of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin then moved to make Russia a free market economy. Plan was to phase out state subsidies and privatize the rest, a shock therapy that would be painful at first but would put Russia on its path to recovery. It was brutal, and it placed Yeltsin in a power struggle with both the legislature and the Russian internal republics. In the end, this was resolved with a federal arrangement that granted autonomy to the various regions and with the literal shelling of the Russian parliament, which resulted in 147 people killed. Well, not everything was resolved. Chechnya, a would-be Muslim republic in the Caucasus, refused to sign up to the federal agreement and would fight a war for its independence on two distinct occasions throughout the 1990s. The Russians responded with atrocities and brutal force, destroying much of Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, leading to tens of thousands of dead. In turn, radical Chechnyans countered with terrorist attacks throughout Russia, most notably the taking of hostages in a Moscow theater in 2002, and the occupation of a school in Beslan, North Ossetia, in 2004, which ended with 333 people dead, 186 of them children, the worst school shooting in history. Still, Russians managed to regain control over Chechnya. Today, it is ruled by Ramzan Kadyrov, a local corrupt strongman. The war in Chechnya also paved the way for a transition in power at the Kremlin. Facing mounting political problems and with weak health, Yeltsin decided to resign and appointed Vladimir Putin, a man perceived as a law and order candidate because of his relentless approach during the Second Chechnyan War. A former KGB man, he has ruled ever since, except during a brief period when he shared power with Dmitry Medvedev to meet constitutional requirements. Faced with yet another constitutional constraint that would have forced him to leave office in 2024, Putin pushed a referendum in 2020 that changed the constitution and will allow him to rule at least until 2036. Putin's rule was characterized early on by some economic success, but since then, it has turned into an economy dominated by oligarchs who are permitted free range as long as they follow the Kremlin line. Those that don't end up in jail or worse, such as Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the CEO of Yukos, an oil company who at one point was the richest man in Russia, until his arrest in 2003. Political suppression has also been expanded to any kind of opposition, most notably against Alexei Navalny, who led some of the largest protests against his rule in 2019, and ended up first poisoned in August 2020 and then imprisoned when he returned to Russia in 2021. The other tool that Putin has employed is the stoking of nationalism, either through grand spectacles like the Sochi Olympics and the 2018 World Cup, or the use of Russian military power to support dictatorships or prevent countries from aligning with the West, including Belarus, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Syria, and of course Ukraine, all intended to project an image of strength. After the latest invasion of Ukraine, Russia seems to be at a crossroads, but it's too early to tell whether this will mean global isolation, a transition from Putin, or political upheaval in Russia.